Welcome, listeners, to the latest episode of Future Secured. So my co-host and myself, Jason Morrell, are going to sit down with Paul McCarty today, software supply chain developer, DevSec Ops leader, startup founder, advisor, snowboarder. That's quite a portfolio of stuff there. Today we're going to discuss the rise of software supply chain attacks and their impacts for businesses and governments. Paul's going to help shed some light on the evolution of cyber weapons, targeting entire software frameworks, the role of state-sponsored actors, and how organizations can prepare for this new frontier in cybersecurity. With DevSecOps becoming critical in the fight against these threats, Paul is going to share some of his insights on the intersection of development, security, and operations. So thank you for joining us, Paul, and over to you, Jason, to get us started.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and great intro, Tommy. You're nailing those now. It's fantastic. So,
Great
Paul,
success.
this is a good one to have a chat about because I think we've known each other for a while, and Tommy as well, probably through Cyber and other entities. But yeah, I just think for the listeners that don't have the advantage of that, can you just give us a bit of a background how you sort of got to where you are now? Because you have been in startups, you've done a lot of things in cybersecurity, but just and Tom will probably ask you more about snowboarding. But from a cyber point of view, let's run through the short time in history of how you sort of got to where you are today.
Yeah, thanks for that, guys, and thanks for having me. It's good to see both of you guys. And you're right, we've known each other for a while. We usually hang out in the U.S. as well as here in Australia. But yeah, so I mean, listen, I got my start, as a teenager, as most of us do. Was a bit of a hacker, and I was first published in 2600 magazine in the early 90s. Won't go into too much more detail, but when I went to university, I really kind of jumped into Unix system admin. So I was working in the computer lab, and then I got my first job as a system admin, and in the mid 90s. Where I'm going with this is that really early in my career, I jumped into Linux really, really early, 96, 97. And I started building security appliances with Linux, and sold those in the mid to late 90s. And so I was writing a lot of code. So I was, so I think the thing that's unique about my background is I came from this kind of distributed Unix data center background, but was writing code and had a security focus from early on. So I was doing DevSecOps, 20 years. Effectively, I was doing it 20 years before somebody even created that word. So it's been a unique journey. I spent some time in the U.S. working for defense contractors and big orgs. But I've also, as you said, I've also done a bunch of work with startups, both my own and other people. So it's been an interesting journey, mate.
Yeah, no, it's it's funny because I did a post yesterday that I found an old boss of mine sent me some photos from when I was using the old 286 and upgraded to a 386. I think in one of the photos there, yeah, so it's just cobbling those to get them running and going was fun back in the day. So you had to be a lot more hands on back then. It's amazing how far we've come, like in that time. But yeah, I think you're admired in the industry. Like a lot of people love your work and love what you do. I wanted to kick off, and I probably might be taking it somewhere where maybe Tommy does want to take it first off, but he can bring it back if he needs to. But the startup stuff I'm really interested in because that's sort of how we sort of cross paths. And it's always been a challenge here in Australia, right? Like to try and get something up and running. And you said, we've spent time, and I think the last time the three of us ran into each other was at RSA earlier this year over in the US. I think it was in May this year. Always a struggle, but that's when you sort of shared with me that what had happened is, with your startup and the situation that had happened there, lessons learned, if you could, what was good, what we need to fix. I know that can be a pretty loaded question, but you, like me, I think, like to call a spade a spade. So if we can sort of just open up with that and just sort of open that up, and then we'll sort of get into some other stuff that Tommy can guide us onto.
Yeah, I do like to be honest, and I have myself to blame for some of the failings of SecureStack, my startup. But I'll say this, that it's hard to build especially a cyber startup in Australia for a number of reasons. The first is that we just are not good as a culture at procuring product, especially product that is sovereign. So there's all this talk about, sovereign capability and whatnot, but I can tell you, having tried to sell into federal and state governments, basically it's almost impossible for a small organization to do that. You can't work your way through it. So the first thing is we need to get better. If we really want to build a sovereign capability, we need to get better at buying sovereign capability. Straight up, it's that simple, right? We love to give away grants in Australia, which are awesome. I've been the beneficiary of some of those grants. But how about we take some of that money and we actually give it to the state organizations or the federal organizations, say, hey, here's some money to buy a product rather than just giving, because then you create a relationship. You create a commercial relationship with somebody that needs something. So, it's tough here to build a, SecureSec was a product company, SaaS-based company. And, we're federal government, state governments are not great at buying SaaS products either. So that's another problem. We're a few years behind. It's a struggle. It is what it is.
Yeah, I think that's it's yeah, and I think a lot of us who sort of out of the gates probably tried to do startups here, especially in the cyber front. I agree. I've done startups in other areas, and I found cyber has been the hardest by far to get any traction, especially here. And we're such a small and immature market, and in a lot of ways behind by a long way as well. So yeah, look, the conversation for another day, but that's something we're looking to solve at the moment with some work we're doing. But we've paved the way, but it's been costly. I know from when startups don't work, it can actually have and you can take it personally. It can have a knock-on effect into your own personality, but I think you always come out bigger, better, and stronger. From the lessons learned. So dip the lid to you, mate, because you've been an inspiration to a lot of people in the industry, and you do a lot of assistance behind the scenes a lot of people don't see. So I just wanted to give a nod to you on that front, and I'm sure the next iteration will be a lot better and stronger, and you'll be a much better person for it. So well done.
Thanks, buddy. Cheers, mate. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's for me. I've spent most of my career as a pay-as-you-go person. It's the biggest transition, and within that time, a whole bunch of ideas and stuff like that never even got as close to being as formed up as what you, Paul, and Jason have done. But throughout the cyber experience time at Off Cyber and Stone and Chalk, it's just this constant narrative, that government is trying to encourage and grow the industry, but to your point, Paul, they just aren't providing those opportunities for Australians. And so, we often talk to people who are, we're helping them focus on the US market and helping them understand how to get into there, or the UK market and things like that, just because, it's just a real challenge here. What is there anything in, retrospect, and I know you admitted there were personal challenges in there as well, but, what is maybe one or two things that would have made a difference that, you could have seen support from the government or, community in Australia?
Yeah, this is going to be spicy, Tom. So the
That's
reality
all right.
is that I should not have raised. I should not have raised funds in Australia. We didn't raise enough to be able to be globally viable against other well-funded American and Israeli startups. So that's the first thing I would have done different, is I would have raised money in the U.S. I probably would have moved back to the U.S. And that's the problem, right? That's the conundrum. Is I love living here. I love living in Queensland. Right now, as I record this, I'm on my patio looking at my pool and looking at the amazing mountains behind me. And I love living here. I don't want to leave. I don't want to leave just to build a startup. So that's a tough one, man, because I know that's what I should have done. My wife and I have had conversations about that, but I didn't want to go back to the US, right? I wanted to be here and I wanted to raise my family here. So yeah. Bummer.
That's the biggest sticking point, mate. That is the number one thing. And this is so common, right? Is that's the thing. Australia, you got it so good here in a lifestyle sense, but from a business sense, we're so fucking lazy. It's just there's no drive to do stuff. We don't support as an ecosystem or from a government sense to say that because what their main concern is obviously is if we let a business go overseas and just say you set up as a Delaware company or whatever your structure is when you go over there, because that's most beneficial for your company and to get where you need to get to in the market. Especially from where your roots come from too, it would have been probably something more on the table for you than anyone else in this country. But as you said, you're choosing to be here, you're paying your taxes here, you're doing everything you can here, but it's not advantaged in any way to actually make that happen. And we're 1.3% of the market from a cyber point of view. And as you said, Israel, right, 30% of the billion-dollar companies come from there. They're doing something right. They've got VCs from America sitting on the doorstep waiting for it to come out.
Right.
No matter what's happening in Israel at the moment, they're still sitting there waiting for the next one to pop, right? We don't have any of that. We have no support.
None of it.
the banks want you to put your house up. So if you want to go do a startup, they go, yeah, we'll take your equity from your house or whatever, and there's no risk, reward, responsibility from anyone here, except that's all put onto the person taking the risk of trying to grow a business. But they want to put their hand out when you become successful, right? So
100%.
it's
and
it's
they want to
yeah.
claim your success too when you're successful, right? Let's be honest. I mean, Threat Matrix, Casada, Bug Crowd, all the best startup, winners that we've had in cyber in Australia had to move to the US and had to build and sell there. And that's not me, as formerly an American having moved to Australia, that's not me taking a cheap shot. That's just me observing the reality of the commercial market, right? To your point, it's just fact. So we need to get better at that. And the first thing is just straight up, like, start procuring, learn how to procure from Australian organizations, learn how to procure product. We know how to buy services in this country. We have no fucking idea how to buy product in this country, right? Let's learn how to do that. So we don't have to buy these big services contracts with, IBM and the others, not picking on anybody in particular, just to be able to get access to product, right? Let's build that capability ourselves.
Yeah, and that's what we've got to do, and that's what we're looking to do. So amen to that, because it's always spoken about, but there's no action. So it's one thing to say, yeah, we want sovereign capability, and then how do you do that? Right? It's a statement, it's a word, but there's no actual formula around that. How do you actually do that?
It's totally an empty sentence, right? It has nothing behind it. Let's put something.
So that's the goal. I think we can end the podcast here now, Tommy. Thanks for your time, Tom. And we'll
drop
the microphone. Yeah, and we'll see you later.
We're out.
Let's shift off and dive into your areas of expertise, which I think is really, really interesting. So let's just kind of start with a deep explanation of development security operations. So what is it? What does it look like today for a business? And what's the role kind of you play in it, Paul?
Well, I mean, I think DevSecOps, at its heart it's a portmanteau, right? It's like three words that we've jammed together, right? Developer, security, and operations, right? I think the great thing about that is it gives us a visual of how we could do it, but that's not how we do it. And what I mean by that is that when I was in the 2000s working for a large insurance organization in the US, we actually took development teams and embedded some engineers from operations together, and that became the basis of our DevOps team. And we haven't ever done anything like that with DevSecOps. So as much as I'm a DevSecOps proponent, and I believe it genuinely has benefit and value, for the most part, DevSecOps is an illusion, right? It's just like because the security teams haven't really kind of moved to the center to join the DevOps movement like we were hoping. And so now what's unfortunately happened, Tom, specifically to your question, is that DevSecOps is typically seen as just let's add a little bit of like security in our CI/CD pipelines and we'll call it DevSecOps, and like, hey, we're winning, right? Which is not actually helping us all that much, and it's certainly not helping us to build the secure guardrails and all these other kind of hyperbole, like hypey things that people are talking about. So real DevSecOps is getting people from those with background in those different areas, engineers, security, SecOps people, and operations people with system admin background, getting them to work in a collaborative way. Does that mean they all have to be part of the same team? No, but they have to work in a collaborative way, and they can't be sitting in isolated silos inside of an organization that never talk and throw spears at each other because they're so combative. That's not how we protect the Australian public from software supply chain attacks. So sorry, that was a bit of a rant there, but we got her done.
Yeah. So that says to me that, in a sense, it's a culture thing, really, isn't it? Because culture eats strategy for breakfast. So it's kind of like setting a new culture between those groups. And I mean, in the way that, I've heard people talk about, pen testers and engineers, there's a real clash there and breaking 100%. Down that culture. So is that the same kind of, things that are really being tackled with DevSecOps?
100%. Yeah. I mean, I think that the problem is 30 years ago when I started my journey, 30 plus years ago, we had a combative relationship between engineers and security, that very, very early security teams that we had, right? And we still, 30 years later, we still have that problem, right? And part of that, frankly, is the fact that security teams have not tried to understand how the software sausage is made. They haven't. What they do is they buy product or they implement processes, and they throw it at the developers, and and developers get this list of 1,000 things, and they're like, well, 99% of those are ridiculous, so I'm just going to ignore the whole thing. It's just a horrible, tenuous, combative, crappy experience. And DevSecOps, was supposed to help, bring people together and help them kind of understand what the roles are of those other parts of the DevSecOps triad. But like I said, it really hasn't happened, unfortunately.
Yeah, but this is the problem, isn't it? In security, period, there is still so much siloing that's happening within the industry. I mean, we talk about, sovereign code, we talk about all the stuff, but just within teams itself or within groups, and that there is so much competition even between companies that are offering the same or similar type things. Walking the floor at RSA, I was flabbergasted by the amount of, 50 businesses doing exactly the same thing with a different badge. And when I said, what is your point of difference? It was bugger all. It was like, oh, we've got a different color logo. Or we get a threat feed from something someone else doesn't, or whatever. It's like, you probably don't, but yeah, cool story, bro. Like, this is the thing is also that when someone stuff like we saw earlier this year with CrowdStrike, other providers jump on top. There's the supportive mechanism of what we should be doing here. As I've always said, the dark side of the web actually does more collaboration and better instigation of things than what we do on this side. And we're trying to protect from these threats all the time, but we're fighting amongst ourselves while the criminals on the other side are having a fucking laugh.
Right. And winning. And they're winning. Right?
Yeah,
that's the problem.
correct.
Right? They're winning. Yeah. We're losing.
Yeah. But there's the collaboration part is something, again, that we need to bring together, just from a macro and a micro point of view. We need to get more collaboration and work together more innovatively to actually try and sort these things out rather than being 100%. So siloed and separated.
When the XZ thing happened, earlier this year, the XZ utils attack happened. It was a watershed moment, but it really hasn't, I don't think, moved the needle dramatically, which is unfortunate. Like we were a hair's breadth away from having a very nuanced, complex attack embedded in every Linux and Mac. It's my Mac had it, right? Like, and in the world, with this really, really powerful payload, and it was really hard to understand, and because they did such a good job of hiding it. And, and by and large, SecOps just kind of ignored it. And it's like, and is that just because they're, they don't understand the space? Well, they certainly don't. When you ask SecOps teams, InfoSec teams, what is software supply chain? They go, I don't know, open source libraries. And it belies how little they understand about the space. And that's why we have this problem that we do. And that's why, I'm spending so much time focusing on this, one, because I have a passion for it, but two, because I don't see anybody else really kind of in the space, especially here in Australia, spending the time sorting that, right? Bringing the visibility that orgs need.
Yeah, no, good point.
Let's dive into a bit more about that. So, software supply chain cyber weapons, they're different from the traditional malware attacks and stuff like that. So, tell us a bit more about what you're seeing in some examples of kind of, some more examples of the danger that they present.
Yeah, I think that, the understanding about the software supply chain and the attacks that are happening there, because those InfoSec teams don't have any kind of visibility into it, they're by and large just bypassing all the tools that we have. They bypass EDR, they bypass intrusion detection, they bypass logging. Why? Because they're not really happening on a developer's laptop. I mean, some portion of them might be, some tiny portion of them, but they're happening out there in the greater, ecosystem. They're happening in places like GitHub and GitLab and Docker Hub and all these other places, right? And the package ecosystems, PyPy and NPM and Ruby Gems. So, it's not surprising the InfoSec doesn't have a lot of understanding about it or visibility into, because it's happening outside of the controls that they've spent, 30 years getting us to install in our networks, in our laptops. It ignores all that because it's happening other places. So yeah, that's part of the problem. But and they're not the overly simplistic understanding of how the attacks work. So they think like, you just download a malicious package and it takes over the developer's laptop, and that's just like, I mean, that's like horse and buggy, and what people, what nation state actors now are building are, like rocket ships compared
rocket
to that.
ships.
Maybe there's a bit of hyperbole there, but the point is that
true.
what I'm seeing, because I spend like all day long in this space, what I'm seeing is is really complex, nuanced attacks that are highly portable. They're highly modular. The bad guys are building them in a way where if you detect a specific package or one kind of component out of the attack and they take it down, GitHub takes it down, or NPM takes it down, or whatever the case may be, they have it up and they have it fixed. They have it patched. The bad guys do really, really quickly with something that's a little bit different, and it's not going to trigger the same kind of detections it did a second ago. And by the way, those detections aren't happening on our laptops with intrusion detection or in our networks, with EDR. They're happening in GitHub and GitLab, and we have to trust our vendors to be able to detect this stuff for us because we have zero capability to detect this stuff ourselves. Yeah, it's a challenge, but I love it, man. And I've kind of become, the squeaky software supply chain guy here in Australia, and I guess in a larger way, and I enjoy that. It's something I have passion for, and I want to help people understand that they can actually attack these challenges. Let's start working on some solutions.
When you're infiltrating supply chains, I mean, we've seen what happened when the Israelis have done that with pages and walkie-talkies just recently. Obviously there's explosives involved in there, but the kind of impact you can have when you can reach through an entire supply chain and essentially dismantle a physical infrastructure is quite incredible. So, I mean, foreign state actors and things like that using these. What kind of evidence have you seen of these things popping up in GitHub and places like that?
Yeah, a lot. So basically, I've been building over the last a while now. I've been building. It's not a product yet. I don't sell it, but it's basically detecting. I call it the early warning system for software supply chain attacks. So imagine like out in the Pacific Ocean, how we have these tsunami detectors that pick up activity and then correlate activity to kind of figure out the strength and magnitude of what's coming. We need the same kind of thing in NPM and PyPy and Docker Hub and AWS and all these other places. And I've been building this kind of capability myself to get eyes on it, right? Just to understand it. And what I'm seeing is just it's dramatic. It's we have the typical threat actors, Russia, Iran, North Korea, as well as a bunch of other, there's other. It's a global phenomena, but they have different kind of unique, fingerprints. So, for example, you see the North Koreans building very, very nuanced, very sophisticated, and their capability has gone up really quickly, dramatically, software supply chain attacks, but they almost universally are looking for crypto, almost universally, right? Whereas the Russians are doing a little bit of that, but they are looking for other stuff, right? And then you've got Brazilian organizations and Turkish organizations and stuff like this, kind of sitting in between. But it's been really fascinating, and the kind of cyber weapons they're building are highly modular. So basically, they'll build something that can then be targeted specifically at CI/CD pipelines, and they'll build something that's then going to go and target just crypto wallet targets. And they use the greater fabric, but then they build these kind of customizations that then plug into the greater fabric. It's pretty sophisticated and scary.
Yeah.
What are the kind of implications if one of these is played out? And I know the North Koreans are literally grabbing crypto to basically fund the government and stuff like that. And Russia and China, everyone's got these individual motives, but is it really just sitting these things there to take advantage of in situations where things might politically go their way, or do you think there's actually structured plans on how they want to use these things?
Yeah, these things are built for long-term persistence. So I think that's one of the big problems why InfoSec hasn't really kind of tackled this, because InfoSec is used to this kind of Boolean attack. It's destructive. It's obvious. Ransomware is a great example of that. All of our EDR is built around this kind of type of attack, and software supply chain attacks, by definition, typically are built in such a way that they, you never see them, right, ever. And if something does get burned accidentally, like the XZ, we just got lucky that somebody found the XZ thing, then that goes away, it gets taken down, but then they plug something else in that's equally as silent and sneaky. So to your question, what are they looking for? It just depends on who the threat actor is, because they've got tasking from their superiors, but The Russians are all over the shop, right? They're doing a little bit of crypto and they're doing the kind of traditional intel gathering. But I think the other thing that people don't realize is that they're also targeting smaller organizations to get data about who it is that they want to actually target. And for example, startups, right? We've got lots and lots. Startups always think, oh, nobody's gonna be targeting me. I'm a tiny little startup. Nation state actors aren't going to target me. But if you happen to have the type of data that they need to be able to target Americans for misinformation campaigns or what have you, right? That the Chinese and the Russians are creating and deploying, then they'll use software supply chain attacks against those organizations to get that data. The software supply chain attack is just a means to an end, right? And we have to think about it. It's just a means to an end. It's just how they want to get what they want, which depends, again, on who it is they're targeting.
And it's not just the bad actors that have started taking use of these kind of offensive supply chain tactics. The AFP have just recently done it with the Ghost, encrypted phones that were built up and deployed. And this is the second time this has been done. It's a global kind of police network. So is there enough of this kind of stuff? Is it the right thing for them to be doing? We need to be playing both sides of this war. What do you think?
Well, yeah, to that last question, absolutely. Do we need to be doing it? Yeah, 100%. If governments aren't trying to build this capability, then they're clueless and they're so far behind the ball that they're losing. Absolutely, the Australians, the Americans, the Five Eye governments, and a bunch of other governments are building this capability because they realize it has the same effect that the bad guys get, right? So, you mentioned a minute ago, the reason that supply chain attacks have kind of become popular is because you build one thing and then the distribution of the supply chain distributes it for you, right? I mean, after all, threat actors are lazy humans, just like the rest of us, and they want to build something they can do one time that automatically then gets distributed, by the supply chain itself. And AFP and others have realized the power of that too as well. So, for example, in the Ghost encrypted app, what did they do? And they haven't said yet specifically what they've done, so I'm making some educated guesses here. But they did say that they had infiltrated the update process for the application, which then allowed them, and if you connect the dots through the different things that they have, so that then allowed them to gain visibility on all of the phones using that through this. So basically, kind of the SolarWinds type attack where they got into the build or update process, and then that gave them access to all the phones that then installed those updates, which then allowed them to see the unencrypted comms. It's an encrypted phone app. The whole point of it is that it's end-to-end encrypted. But when you get yourself into the updater and you can push a malicious update onto all of those client devices, in this case, all those phones, suddenly that allows you to see clear text, pre-encrypted comms. And, that appears to be what they've done. And kudos to them. It looks like a very cool, sophisticated operation, and mad respect to him.
Tom's worried they're going to use it on his updates now. So he's always installing updates when available now. He's a little bit concerned about his next update.
Well, isn't it funny? We used to tell people turn on automatic updates, right? It was like one of the core kind of security things, right? And it still is legitimately, it's still a problem. By the way, on my Qantas flight back from Singapore, they rebooted my entertainment system in front of me, and it was, Jason mentioned 286 and 386. It was a 386 system running in front of me, running a version of Red Hat from 2002.
Beautiful. That's right. That's what I love to hear. Yeah, that's so good. On the 3G network.
That's a really kind of scary thing to have seen. Right. It doesn't build a lot of confidence,
All the firewall holes that vendors ask us to pop through the external perimeter to allow their devices to talk to phone home or whatever the case may be, right? And that's not just egress. Sometimes, unfortunately, that's ingress too as well. And you see that, on Shodan. You just got to go to Shodan and you can find this stuff right out there. And I think that's something sometimes people don't realize, is they think, because they don't know that you can just go to Shodan and find this stuff, they don't realize the bad guys are using that kind of visibility as well. So
it's funny too, but Paul was really close to his Starlink satellite, so he was okay on the flight, but he was more concerned about some of the other people on the flight. He had a direct link to Elon, so he was okay.
Well, you know what? I didn't get to use my entertainment system because it rebooted for 20 minutes, and I gave up. I sat there and had to look at the 386 Red Hat boot screen for 30 some minutes, and I just gave up. But and it's just evidence of the fact this kind of stuff is everywhere. This kind of stuff is everywhere, right? And turning on automatic updates used to be a default no-brainer to protect our systems, and now sometimes, and we're not trying to tell people don't do that.
No.
Right. But sometimes it works against you.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I think this is and us in the space, and this is something we're trying to crack out of as well, Paul, is that, you can talk about multi-factor authentication and people go, oh yeah, but there's ways around multi-factor authentication, but you're much better with it, right? And with automatic updates and with password managers, even though these things can be, have troubles from time to time, we've got to be very careful with this messaging, because inside our own bubble and our own environment cyber, we know all these intricate stories, but we haven't even got people past first or second base on cybersecurity. We can't now start to scare them off the fact of multi-factor is a good idea, or updates are a great idea, because they're usually patching something. And this is something we just I want to put this disclaimer in here. Everyone, please do it if you just do that sort of stuff, right? Because 99 times out of 100, or even higher than that, it's going to be fine. We're talking about very minute cases here, and there are ways around it, but you need to be someone important for them to want to try and get around it, right? The average citizen is not going to have to worry about someone trying to hot their multi-factor or try and get into an update or something like that. This is at a much higher level.
And to that point, Jason, like that's a great point. To that point, I've actually recently, heard somebody say, they were talking about password managers and like, we'll keep using our existing process, because we're not going to use a password manager because of LastPass. And you're like, mate, and I think people use it, frankly, people will use it, software engineers or whoever will use these rare cases
events
to just not have to do the thing that they know they should be doing.
Yeah.
Right.
And I don't give a fuck if it's Bitwarden or 1Password or whoever, right? And the thing is, I think LastPass, from what I know from behind the scenes, is you learn a lot more from your mistakes, right? So as soon as you get potted like that, that actually makes you a stronger and more resilient business, from actually having those situations happen, from any business I know, no matter who it is, whether it's LastPass or CrowdStrike or anything like that. As soon as these mistakes happen, and in business, we know from doing business, right? When you stuff up, that's where you have your biggest learning, and you actually adjust things. When things just cruise along and everything's fine, no one makes any adjustment, right? It's in the shitstorm where you actually make your biggest, fixes and actually try and actually get things better. So I would trust more a company that's gone through shit and actually got out the other side than I would one that has never been potted before.
Yeah, I totally agree. And as a society, Australia has to get better at advertising and being okay with people talking about their mistakes, because if you're not doing that, it creates this environment where people think that they shouldn't talk about their mistakes, or even worse, they don't see anybody else talking about their mistakes, so they just assume that nobody else is getting popped, right?
Yeah.
That's why I really wish that the data breach notification list was public again, so we could really see the scope of the organizations that are getting popped. Some of these organizations are getting popped.
That's what we said, Paul, on this show before. Like, the thing is that, if we actually put the shutters up so we can see what's happening, so we can help other people within reason. Obviously, there's certain things you cannot disclose, but we need to be sharing. And so, like I do, that the CISOs all share, sort of war stories or things behind the scenes, but that's close within that circle. But we need to have that spread outside of that scenario, so that we can all go, what are lessons learned and what do we need to do? And that's something the government should be looking to facilitate, I think, at a broader spectrum level, so that we can actually get some benefit from it. Because, we see stuff with Optus or Medibank and all those sorts of things and these patches, and you find out, and it's usually a result of an inquiry which happens, months or even years down the track, that we actually learn it's too late by then. Cybersecurity moves too quickly that you can't wait 6 months. You can't even wait a month or a week or a day, right? You need to find these things out straight away so you can start to fix them.
And I'm going to take that as an opportunity to kind of poke the Australian government, because I think that the government here in Oz isn't doing a good enough job about really kind of encouraging, or in some cases forcing, us to uplift. So, for example, in the U.S. right now, at 20 minutes ago or whatever, Tom mentioned the medical devices. In America, the FDA has one of the strongest software supply chain set of requirements. If you want to create a new device, medical device in America, you have to get a license from the FDA, and they now require you to create an SBOM and to prove that you're scanning your source code and you're doing all these things. And if you can't do that, well, guess what? You don't get a license
Okay.
to create your medical,
Mm.
and we have nothing like that here in Oz. Nothing.
Mm.
People laugh about S-bombs and how the executive that the Biden administration created around S-bombs. The reality is that S-bombs are a great thing, and I hear people talking about them and they don't really understand their benefit. You know, wouldn't you like a near real-time understanding of everything that's inside your application? So in case there's a new threat, you can go and look at your S-bomb and you can identify whether or not that new threat is in your code, right?
Yeah.
Wouldn't you like that?
Yeah.
And an S-bomb, provided it's a good S-bomb, provides that. And we have, sure, it's mentioned in the ISM and in the Critical Infrastructure Act, but there's no real encouragement from the government for organizations here in Australia to create S-bombs. And so guess what? We're not.
There's a real a disconnect, I think, between what you're talking about and the actual what people see out there in the world. So I'd taken my son probably 2 months ago for a knee MRI. At that moment, a lady in her 80s came in with her carer. A couple of the medical technicians were stuffing around with the device that eventually they uploaded an update onto, and they took her off to a room to hold it against the pacemaker and update the data. So just using those near field connections. So any flaws or whatever, any supply chain bad code or anything is ended up on her pacemaker. That is kind of that's the end game. And I think that in society we're still seeing a massive disconnect, and it's almost like this black curtain that falls down behind people when they get on their iPhone and they look at their apps and they have no consciousness, back to what we were talking about earlier, like messing around on Apple IIes. I mean, I remember as a 5 and 6 year old, my dad was using a Cray 2 in Boulder, Colorado, and walking around with boxes of ordered punch cards that, my God, if you tripped over and fell out, and they all came out. But now it's just such a background part of our lives that we don't pay the attention it deserves in order just to keep us secure, really.
100%. And using your scenario there about the app, the medical app, even if the medical app itself hasn't been compromised, if some other app on the phone has been compromised, or if some other app on the phone is just really greedy about grabbing network data and other things, like, I don't know, a certain app that starts with tick, like the reality is that, the software supply chain attacks against phone apps, almost nobody in Australia is kind of, thinking about that or tackling that. And the reality is that, you don't even need to compromise that particular thing to be able to then do something terrible to it. If you understand that there's a app on your phone that is controlling somebody's pacemaker, even if you haven't compromised that app, if you compromise some other app and you decide, hey, this is a good time in the middle of this procedure to reboot the phone, right? We need to be spending more time thinking about these things instead of thinking about, nuclear subs, maybe.
And that's where the budget issue is too, right, Paul? Because I know a couple of months ago I was talking to some hospitals. It was a Victorian government, event, cyber, and one of the hospitals there was sort of talking about budget. So we're saying, just say you need a solution, 100K. They're at this in Victoria to the level where they're like, we can't spend 100K. We know we need that for hospital and for protection of the system, but that means that we can't then run electricity, or we have to close down 3 or 4 beds, and it gets to that point, right? Which is, this is the crazy dichotomy that they're in. The other thing he said was, and this was just for this financial year, we can't hire any new staff, and if anyone quits, we can't replace them. That's the dire straits that they're in. We talk about medical, and we're talking about what's happening in this country, having states and the federal, and having all this mix mash of what has to happen, and this whole federation thing causes so many issues all the way through the supply chain period for government and state and councils and stuff like that, that these sorts of things happen way too regularly, and budgets are way too thin in important areas.
Sure, yeah. In a lot of these applications, the government is building, wants to use SSO to make it really easy for people to log into those things, but then they haven't really kind of thought through, what is SSO? When I'm integrating to multiple identity providers, things like maybe GitHub. GitHub is actually one of the world's largest identity providers, and not many people realize that. You can log into Microsoft using your GitHub account. You can actually get $200 free dollars worth of credit in Azure just with a GitHub account, and you can create a GitHub account totally anonymously. that's one of the world's largest identity providers, and people are rushing to add integrations to GitHub and others. I'm not just picking on them without really kind of realizing, how does that disturb our identity, our understanding of what's a real human identity versus what's a fake non-human identity. Again, I don't see a lot of people in Australia kind of thinking through the consequences of their SSO integration sometimes.
Yeah, I think we sort of in Australia lean way too much on other countries, in particular the US and stuff like that. And copy homework from the UK and other areas. We have so many smart people here and can do so many things. And you talk about bug crowd, like Casey having to go to the US, and Sam, from Casada and all these sorts of things. We and even when John and I were doing cyberware, you have to go overseas. The market caps out here way too quick, and you just can't make enough money, seriously, for what it costs to actually run businesses here and have teams and employ people here. But then the government keeps following and copying homework from these other countries, yet not making any clear pathway for us to get there where the best people are and get the assistance to actually grow and protect not just Australia, but the rest of the world.
Well, I mean, to that point, one of the biggest challenges I had at SecureStack when we were selling, we were early to what is now called the ASPM market. Now, ASPM is blown up, but we started in 2017. We were early to that market. The reality is that even when we sold into organizations here in Australia, typically they did not have the subject matter experts inside their organization to deploy and manage these applications. So we've got multiple problems that are stitched together to create one, big kind of messed up system where we need better subject matter experts to be able to build this stuff. But guess what? A lot of our subject matter expertise bugger off to the US because it pays better and they can, looks better on their CV. So, and you can buy a house in the US.
That's right. Correct. Correct. Yeah, exactly.
On $120,000 a year. You can actually buy a house in many places in America. Not San Francisco.
No, not San Fran and not New York. But these are the points that I think, it's a whole bundle of stuff, and we're trying to go back with the stuff Tom and I are involved in, right back to schools, right? How do we create a career pathway and teach these basics of cyber all the way back there? It's this talk could go forever because there's so much crossover with the stuff that we're doing and you're trying to do that. It could be a 15-part episode, I reckon, just on these few points. So, but I'll let Tommy control it again, or else we will go rogue.
Well, look, I'm gonna. No, you're right. I'm going to ask a last question, and I think I'd like to bring us back to where we were in the beginning. So what would it take? So a hypothetical here that, what you're currently working on has legs and stuff like that. What would you need differently in support in order to be able to build this in Australia? What changes do we need in the kind of infrastructure, the government support and stuff like that to make you willing to do a second chance without having to move overseas?
Well, I'm going to come at this from an interesting kind of specific angle. I think that, one of the challenges we had at SecureStack was trying to sell, a product that helped software engineering, software development to security teams. And that's just a challenge. That's a challenge in the US, not just here. But in this case, the way I'm thinking about this now is I'm thinking, okay, what if I sold something? What if I built something that could provide threat intelligence or something else that SecOps teams or InfoSec teams knew how to consume, right? Rather than ASPM, where you have to install it in the CI/CD pipelines, and security teams in Australia don't have access to that. So it's kind of a broken way of trying to sell. If I were to try to sell something that helped us with the software supply chain threats that we have, but was specifically built for InfoSec buyers, something like maybe CTI, threat intel, which is one way I'm kind of thinking about this. I've been talking to Mike Monick at DroneSec about his product. But then the challenge becomes, to your question, Tom, the challenge becomes, are Australian organizations that pay for threat intel now, are they interested in threat intel that can help them identify software supply chain attacks? And I have my concerns that we don't have the maturity here in Australia to buy something like that. So even when I go out of my way to find a way to try to sell something that can help us identify these things, right, and mitigate these challenges, I still run into a problem where perhaps the maturity isn't there. Now, I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? One of the reasons I came on here is I want to see if are there Australian organizations that would be interested in that kind of threat intel? And if so, I'd love to talk to them. I don't have a product to sell. There's no kind of commercial immediate thing here, but our Australian organizations that buy threat intel right now, are they interested in threat intel that can help them address software supply chain threats? We'll see.
Yeah, the drone sec's a good point to bring up. They're a good organisation and got some really good people involved in that organisation. So yeah, I think we've got people that are willing to do it. I just think we just need more, and we just need people to wake up to what the actual consequence is. I think people play way too safe and only do the bare minimum based upon what they think they need to do to stay within the legal ramifications, whereas
Sure.
you really need to do a lot more than that. And I think people need to think way outside the box and think down the track and not wait for an incident to happen where it's like, oh, gee, we dodged the bullet, when someone else gets hit, and say, we really need to protect ourselves and we need to forward think on how best we can do that. So getting smart people together and actually working in working groups, I think here in Australia would be a great start, and actually doing proper collaboration and innovation together and then get some backing for that. That's the next logical step for me.
Well, and we need to be, and because we don't necessarily understand this new set of threats, don't ignore it. So like 3,000 years ago, before somebody developed the arrow, and we all we used was hitting each other with clubs or sticks or whatever we did, 4,000 years ago. And then somebody developed the arrow, and people up until that point weren't used to looking up for threats, right? In the same way, in my weird metaphor, we need to start thinking about the fact that just because we don't understand that there are threats out here in this other space, in this case, the software supply chain, doesn't mean those threats are not real. We need to be looking up. So,
especially with AI. I'm surprised Tom didn't mention that. Yeah.
I was actually really happy that when AI did not get mentioned today.
Yeah.
We can save that for another one. Look, thank you so much, Paul, for joining us, and to all the listeners out there, please find him on LinkedIn, reach out about that conversation around supply chain threats and the threat intelligence around that. Some information I think would be fantastic for Paul, a bit of market analysis. Thank you again, Jason, for joining us as my co-host.
Thanks,
Look, I really love the way that we kind of top and tailed this around the challenges of a startup and filled it up with some really great conversations about the dangers out there that we're not paying enough attention to. So please, as I said, follow Paul on LinkedIn. Reach out to the Australian Cyber Network LinkedIn page and follow them for more great information. And of course, like and subscribe to the Future Secure podcast on YouTube to hear more. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks
Tommy.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Paul.